There's an example I gave with my mom. She asked me why I don't believe Jesus anymore. And I knew I couldn't say, well, because Jesus and Jesus and New Testament and Jesus, because that's when her defenses and I imagine cognitive dissonance would set in even more. And she'd double down on her faith and she'd be afraid because she's afraid of hell. She says that to me. And I just said, can I tell you a story from the Greek world? And I told her the Odyssey in a nutshell, how Odysseus goes off to war. He's in love with his wife, Penelope. He goes off to war to defend his nation. And the reason I said that is my dad was also a soldier who retired, Green Beret, who has gone to war, has gone overseas, has been away from us for long periods of time. We've worried about him. He's almost died several times, things like that. Mm-hmm. So I use this analogy to paint something close to home for her. I tell her how Odysseus goes to war in Trojan battle with all his men. On his way home, he gets lost. He promised that he was going to come home to her and his son, Telemachus. On his way home, he gets lost and ends up on an island with a Cyclops and a witch, Circe, and gets trapped in this faraway land by a goddess who is in love with him and all this stuff. And finally, he gets granted to come home, but it's 20 years later. The suitors that are supposed to be there at the house are literally trying to take his wife. He comes home, but he can't come home as he looks. The goddess disguises him to make him look like a beggar, to make him look like a homeless man. He does not look the same. So he goes home and he's greeted by his wife after, I'm not going to get into every little minutia of detail. Long story short, he's welcomed into the home. Few people slowly discover his true identity in the entire path. And each time I told it in such a way that is like the story that my mom starts crying. My mom starts crying because she's forgotten why she even asked the question to begin with. At the end of the story, just to get you a nutshell, he is in love and making love to his wife in bed again, as it was at the beginning. He's back with her. He's loving her. And everything is almost happily ever after at the end of the story. A lot of tragedy along the way, but he makes it to her. My mom's crying. And I said, well, you like that? And she's like, yeah. And I said, well, that's practically the canonized story for the Greeks. Many of the gods played a role in that, the Odyssey and the Iliad. And that was what the Greeks technically believed. They had that as their story. Mom goes, that's a powerful story. And I said, well, just like they believe that story, Christians believe the Jesus one. And many of the elements in the New Testament seem to also borrow from that older story in how they paint Jesus. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is I don't believe those stories literally happened, but I think they're true in some ways. There's some truth. And I don't mean true in the empirical, historical sense, but there's some deep meaning we can gain from them. Well, I could do the same for Jesus, I said to Mom. And Mom's like, okay, let's change the subject now. But you see what I did there is I helped her to understand and couch it in a way that wasn't as offensive. You can't, it's hard to do that with these guys like David Wood and them. They've got their entire...
with an apologist, it's really hard. But with religious people in general, it is different to when you're trying to convince someone of something purely factual. So if you're trying to convince someone of, say, the shape of the earth, you're going to be talking facts.
Right.
But something that resonated with me when I was younger was Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he would say, here are the facts and here's the sensitivity to your state of mind. And it's between the two that you can make impact. So you got to really read the individual and know how to make that progress. And actually, I found with counter apologetics, you're actually better off not focusing on the specifics. They want you there. That's where they want you. Really deal with the bigger story. Such as what we've been doing today, pointing out the fact that the reason they're really confident is they need it to be true. It has to be true. Otherwise, the bigger story falls apart.
So, is a commitment to naturalism a good reason to reject the resurrection? As Alvin Plantinga and others have shown, naturalism as a worldview is fundamentally incoherent because it ends up undermining the reliability of the cognitive faculties required to affirm it.
All right, so David is completely moving on. He's moving on to a completely different topic. He's going to be talking about naturalism. He thinks he can debunk naturalism, and therefore having a naturalistic commitment is not something that you can have when it comes to considering specifically the miracles to do with Christianity. He wouldn't, of course, be quite as happy as saying this with Islam and whatnot. And he's going to present a variation of closer to C.S. Lewis's version of the evolutionary argument, against naturalism. But yeah, let's hear it.
If I could just make one comment as this too, as someone who's not familiar with the naturalist, I'm not in depth aware of the philosophies and epistemological backgrounds and such that you are. I would say, as someone, as a normal common sense person who once believed everything the Bible taught and just hook, line, and sinker accepted the entire thing, the demons, the gods, except I didn't realize there was polytheistic tendencies. I didn't know how to deal with the divine council, different things. As a Christian, it was one God and he had angels and there's demons and stuff like that. And then the devil, that kind of worldview. What ends up happening when you're trying to act like, well, we shouldn't start skeptical. We should actually be open to all of these things and not just be critical up front and need evidence to prove they exist first before we just have this open mind and thinking they do. Is I went from that worldview to thinking maybe ifrits and leprechauns and demons and chupacabras and, where do you draw the line on mythical, fictional, fairies, the whole nine? How do you pretend that you should not then open your mind to every and all mystical, magical, nonsensical things? And that's what they don't get. I'm willing to play their game, even though I tend to be skeptical that any of these things actually exist and that the figments of our imagination and part of fiction and maybe part of our human lack of awareness of mental capacities that we're not really able to, in those days, understand, like mental health illnesses and such that we call demons or whatever it might be. Today, we have better explanations. I say all of that to say, they won't follow that consistency. They want to pretend, they just want to open the door for their versions, and they don't want to let ifrits and they don't want to let the various other deities and demons and strange mythical creatures from other cultures and such exist. They don't grant them the same credibility. And that is where I say special pleading, even in this, it's just to make you convinced of their version. They're not following it consistently. And that's what annoys me.
And that is such a fantastic point, because people that criticize naturalism in the way that Plantinga does and the way that C.S. Lewis does and the way that David's doing, they have it completely backwards. So if you ask a naturalist, why are you a naturalist? It's never, I started with this. And the thing is they look at naturalism in the same way that they look at theism. Theism's this big package. Here you go. Here's what you've got. Try figure out what's going on. Sure, but this is your package. It doesn't work like that with naturalism. Rather, and as you pointed out, you end up learning a bit more about the world, because by default, you're going to believe all sorts of things. This is why cultures believe miracles by default. It's why, the stats that he showed earlier, we're much more susceptible to believing bullshit when we don't know much. But as we learn more and more, we go, damn, that God of the gaps was filled. That wasn't a miracle. That was actually this. And you end up building up a structure where science keeps winning and it keeps providing greater explanatory value. And as you build up that framework, you have methodological naturalism, where you go, you know what? I'm pretty, for all intent and purposes, that's my default now. It's not I start with it. It's rather, this is a really good piece of equipment in my mind that works and makes better sense of the world. It could be violated. As we were saying earlier on, there are things you can discover which will violate it. Yes, naturalism will adapt for it in most cases, such as quantum mechanics. But it isn't like this default position of, nope, there's no supernatural stuff. And then when you do want to say that there's supernatural stuff, when you do want to broaden your mind, you don't want to broaden your mind so, open your skull up so much that your brain falls out. And that is what's being asked of us when it comes to certain miracles, such as those that you find in Christianity. So if you say you had a miracle where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a statue appeared. Wow, you're going to need extraordinary evidence for this. Like this is an extraordinary claim. However, compare that to Jesus's resurrection and the narrative around Christianity. Not only did this incredible event happen, according to Christians, this incredible miracle, but we also have to buy that if you're not convinced of this proposition, you are deserving of eternal torment. It's just the sheer nonsense of it all, like the sheer, just how improbable it is. Like, not all miracles are built with equal probability. Like, some of them, we all all of us, Christians included, stick in a bullshit category, but
Yeah.
arbitrarily open it up to the point where you go, no, that fits my one in. Like, no,